I think I've just been around these stories for so long and sat in these circles for so long that it's just something that I maybe unconsciously feel a responsibility to talk about. But I do it, and I've been told I do this, and I'm very proud of that. I do it in a subtle way so that people are still enjoying the story, but they're also thinking about these things now.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Amanda Peters, author of the 2023 novel The Berry Pickers, a book about a 4-year-old girl who goes missing while her family is visiting Maine for the summer to pick blueberries. It's a book that won both the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and the Crime Writers of Canada's First Novel Award, among many, many other accolades. Her new book is a collection of short stories called Waiting for the Long Night Moon. Amanda Peters, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You wrote these stories before your novel, The Berry Pickers. In the acknowledgments, you call them your training wheels. Can you tell us about where in your own timeline as a writer these stories came from?
Yeah, I can. When I first started writing seriously back in 2012, I was writing short fiction that really didn't have anything to do with my Indigenous self, because I had this feeling that because I was raised off the reserve and I don't speak my own language, that I didn't really have the right to tell those stories. But then I wrote one story at a workshop, and it's in this collection. It's called Winter Arrives, and everything just started to come alive creatively for me. I was like, these are the stories I meant to write. Here it is. There was so much more love and joy in writing them, and the writing was better. So I just started writing the stories that came to my mind. Stories, some of them were given to me by other people, like like a little tiny nugget, right,
Mhm.
would come, and then I would write a full story from a nugget. And I thank those people in the acknowledgments for their generosity. But then I was just like, okay, here I go. And I never thought I could write a novel. So I was like, I'll just write some short fictions because novels are hard, they're big. And I just kept writing and writing and writing, and here they are.
Can you tell me about one of those little nuggets?
I can. This is a funny one because it's absolutely nothing to do with the actual story. It's very strange, but I love books, and I found a really old physics textbook, like 1930s physics textbook or something like that, at a library sale, and I bought it. Don't know why. So
Sure.
I was just flipping through it one day, and one of the questions in it was like, if you live to be 80, how many heartbeats will your heart beat? And it's 3 billion is the answer.
Mhm.
And then I was like, in my head, I was like, well, that's interesting. But what if you die at like 25 and not 80? Do you live in a void? Do you exist in a void until that 3 billionth? This is how my brain sometimes
Yeah.
works, right? And
Yeah.
then I was just sitting there thinking about all this, and a whole entire story came out of that. And it's called 3 billion heartbeats. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Did you mentioned not thinking you could write a novel at the time when you were writing these stories?
mhm.
As you put this collection together, did you see how how writing a novel has changed you as a writer?
Yes, it has. I tend to be more verbose now. So I write a lot more. I don't know if it's changed me. I don't know if I could go back to short fiction now.
Hmm.
Like I don't know if I have that ability anymore. And short fiction is very difficult to write, right? You're trying to fit so much into such a short space. And some of these are flash fiction even. So I don't know how much it changed me, but I don't know if I could write a short story again. I probably could if I forced myself, but now I'm very into the novel.
Hmm. Uh, The Berry Pickers, as I understand it, began as you thought it was a short story. That's what you wrote.
I
You
did, yes.
and you brought it to a workshopping context and it and it and it expanded. You were encouraged to make it a lot bigger. Can you speak about that experience? How finished was the short story? Were you like done, ready, sending it for submissions?
I wasn't sending it for submissions, but in my head, I was done with it. I was like, okay, this is the short story because I can't write a novel. So this
Hmm.
is a short story. And then I ended up in 2018 at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity residency there for emerging writers. And in my workshop, everybody's like, this isn't a short story. This is a first chapter of a novel.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay. And prior to that, people who had read it, only a few like close friends, family, I said, I feel like there's more to this story. And I was like, but I don't know if there's more to this story. And finally, after so many people telling me this is a novel, I was like, okay, let's see if it is.
Mm.
Let's see what I can do with it. So I started to write it. I did an outline, a fully fleshed out outline. Just okay, this is maybe if it was a novel, what I want to talk about. And funny enough, it was only Joe's story, the entire outline.
And Joe is the brother.
He is, yes, the brother, because it's a dual narrative between a brother and a young girl and a sister. So I was just writing his, and then she kind of came into my head and said, I'd like to tell my story too. And I was like, does she have a story? I said, well, let's see if she does. So I started to write, and I'm like, okay, there it is. So it did take 2 years for me to get over the fact that it was not a short story.
Mm. Mm. Did getting over it include writing out the novel, or was that strictly like emotional processing over 24 months?
I had no choice actually. I forced myself because I was accepted to do my MFA at the Institute for American Indian Arts in New Mexico.
Hmm.
And I had to submit creative packets and I used this. So I was like, okay, I have to write now. I have to write this novel that I think other people convinced me that it was a novel. So I would submit chapters. And finally I was like, okay, this is a novel. Here we go. Do 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 do.
I want to spend a little bit more time on the berry pickers before we dive too much into the stories because I wanted to ask um about the origin of the berry pickers. I understand this was um your peers telling you to write a novel of this wasn't the only aspect of the berry pickers that was like assigned to you. Your dad kind of needed you to write a novel about or to write something about berry picking. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so my dad and his family. So my dad is one of 14 children. So there's 16, including my grandparents, and they would go every summer in the 60s and 70s, early 70s, to the berry fields of Maine and pick berries. And they would use that money and come home and use it for school supplies and to get through the winter and stuff like that. And he's told stories about the berry fields my whole life.
Mm,
And when your dad's telling a story for the 100th time and you're kind of zoning out. But he said, I really think when he found out I was writing for seriously, you should write about us. And I said, Dad, I write fiction. I make things up. I don't write nonfiction.
mm,
But he said him and I decided we would go down to the berry fields of Maine in August of 2017. And so we did that. We went down to the berry fields. And while I was down there, that first line of that first chapter, the day that Ruthie went missing, just came to me down there. And I was like, okay, maybe this is a story that maybe I could write. And again, I was still thinking this is a short story or
mm,
something. And it was really nice because my dad told me how everything worked down there, like how berry picking happened, what they did, where they stayed, how they spent their free time. So it gave me a lot of background for that beginning part of the story.
Was he surprised to see you pick it up and run with it in that way, having told the story a thousand times and being ignored 999 times?
Yeah, I think so. I still love my dad's stories, and he loves telling them, and a lot of them are funny. So, when he gets laughing at his own
Yeah.
stories, and then I get laughing, and yeah, my siblings get laughing. So, yeah, yeah, it was just a really fun experience to have that, and it's a really fun experience now being able to share it with my dad. So.
Mm. Were you surprised at the nature of the story of where you took it? Because it goes, I mean, it's it's the furthest thing from a nice trip earning some extra spending money with family.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I had a friend tell me that our stories come from the ancestors and we're gifted them and it's our job to tell them. So I go with that because I don't know where some of this stuff comes from. I just sit down in the computer and here it comes, right? Or I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and grab my little notebook or those kind of things. So I don't really know where they came from. I do know that this is a sad book, and it does touch on some heavy themes, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So I don't know if I intended to write the theme and intend to write those things. I just wanted to tell a really good story. And also, I know it is a sad book, but I feel that I feel like I put joy in there, and I wanted people to understand that Indigenous families are loving and joyful and caring as well.
Hmm. And it really is a book about love, um, showing up in a place that just causes that's also just part of causing harm.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I always say that Joe is because I don't think I'm giving any big spoilers here, but Joe leaves for a time, and he does that because of love. It's the ultimate form of love. Is he's afraid that he'll hurt his family, so he leaves them.
Mhm,
And I think that's to him anyway in the book. That is the way he shows love for his family. So there is
mhm,
a lot of love and compassion.
mhm. The story from which this new collection of old stories,
Mhm.
takes its title, "Waiting for the Long Night Moon." Um, can I ask you to speak a bit about that story? It's a marvelous centerpiece to this collection.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure what sparked this one necessarily. I do remember writing the scene where he's sitting on by a lake, looking out over the lake and sees a deer
This is
and
Mr. White Duck.
Mr. White Duck. So he's sitting there, and that's how it started. And then I kind of build around it because it's
Hmm.
just in my head, it was just a beautiful scene with the moon and the snow and the blue of winter. And so I was like, okay, now what am I going to write around this? So yeah, I was very excited when I finished it, and it had all come together, and it just it worked. There's this thing when you're a writer when you're struggling, and then it just comes together, and you're like, oh, it did it. It worked. It came together. So I was really excited about that. And I sent it away and it actually won the Indigenous Voices Award for unpublished prose back in 2021. So I think that's why the people who are smarter than me in the publishing world have decided to name the short story collection Waiting for the Long Night Moon.
There's no one, we're all just faking it. Just, I don't know if nobody's told you this. We're all just making it up.
I can believe it.
Um, this story, where Mr. White Duck is kind of the central voice, it is fascinating because we can see in his interactions with other characters, he is taciturn. He does not have a lot to say.
Hmm.
There may be people who would say that they know him and may not be able to immediately call to mind his speaking voice, because you
Hmm.
get a sense that he doesn't waste a lot of words.
No.
But he does tell the story. Towards the end of the story, he was planning on telling a different story. He makes a last second decision to tell the story of the young girl who died before she was meant to,
Hmm.
which does pick up that theme. It's an indirect reference to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's not
Hmm.
the only time in this book that comes up, and it is I want to say a gentle allusion to it, but it's not. You know, the story's kind of temperature kind of stays cool at that point. It doesn't become
Hmm.
overly intense, but it is a gesture in that direction. And I was struck as I read these stories, how that theme kept coming up, and how that must have meant that you've been finding it showing up in your work for a long time. Um, is it a theme you're conscious of invoking, or is it among those things that, I mean, is it one of those things that the ancestors just keep just kind of pushing onto your desk?
Yeah, I don't intentionally do that. It's just something I write about. And I say sometimes that maybe it's the product of my experiences. Like I haven't directly experienced missing murdered Indigenous women in my family. I'm grateful for that.
Mm.
But I have sat in circles with residential school survivors. I have a friend who is a 60 scoop taken from her family. I have spoken to people who have lost their sisters or mothers to this epidemic. And that's all through my work. Because I worked for the Atlantic Policy Congress in Atlantic Canada, working with Indigenous communities. And then I worked with my own community of Glooscap First Nation for many years. So I think I've just been around these stories for so long and sat in these circles for so long that it's just something that I feel maybe unconsciously feel a responsibility to talk about. But I do it, and I've been told I do this, and I'm very proud of that. I do it in a subtle way so that people are still enjoying the story, but they're also thinking about these things now, and they're not feeling that they're being lectured to,
Mhm.
but it's starting conversations, and I feel really grateful that that's happening, that people who otherwise wouldn't talk about the fact that a little brown child can go missing or a young girl can go missing and no one notices. I just feel like that should be a conversation, and I'm glad if any part of my stories can help that conversation start.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess it also, it seems to touch what we were just speaking about like love as kind of a driving force in narrative,
Mhm. Mhm.
because in many cases, I'm thinking of, you know, 3 billion heartbeats is there. There's Waiting for the Long Night Moon. There are other instances, and when you do touch on this violence that disproportionately impacts women and girls, Indigenous women and girls,
Mhm.
um, there's it's never far from people who love them. or the
Mhm.
people that they love, the people that they are leaving behind.
Mhm.
It's never a girl in a ditch. It's never that sort of framing that one expects in a lot of like crime narratives.
Right.
I imagine that's just hard. I mean, maybe that's my question is, my goodness, what a hard thing to be showing up to in your creative life.
Yeah, it can get hard. And even with 3 billion heartbeats, I struggled writing that one. And then I thought, and I discussed with many friends about pulling it and not,
Mm,
and just putting it in the fire and saying, but then I had Indigenous friends who said, no, this story needs to be told because these things happen to our women. And but I just felt, and I don't know, like again, the inspiration for it, I'm not, which was just a random physics book, but I just felt the need to tell that story. And what if, right? What if?
mm,
Yeah, it is hard. Sometimes I do take a break, but like I said, I just feel, I guess, a sense of responsibility to tell these stories, which is funny because at first I wouldn't tell these stories when I first started writing, and now I kind of feel like it's a responsibility to tell these stories.
mm. As I read this book straight through, in sequence, one story after the next, observing themes that were, coming into the foreground and receding. Sometimes there were counterpoints and things were set in relief. Um, I mean, an example of that would be Waiting for the Long Night Moon
Mhm.
is followed by the story of the crow, a
Mhm.
retelling. And that's a fable. And it's a fable about what the crow sacrificed and why it's the animal we know it to be today.
Mhm.
To understand that the crow was not always as it was, and that we are beneficiaries of a wonderful gift,
Mhm.
and that's why the crow is reminding us, crows are beautiful in their own ways.
I love crows.
Um, so that piece, the story of the crow, it's beautiful, it's compact, it's a little diamond. Um, but it does contrast against Waiting for the Long Night Moon, where the crow experiences loss. There is loss.
Mhm.
There is loss in Waiting for the Long Night Moon. The crow is making a sacrifice, is offering a gift. Long Night Moon, things are taken.
Mhm.
I wondered, as I was making these connections in my mind as a reader, how did you determine the order that the reader would encounter these stories?
Yeah, that was a process actually. I started working on these short stories, like organizing them and
Hmm.
editing them with Katarina Vermette when she chose me for the Rising Stars program. So she helped me work on these a little bit, and she's like, "Order is very important in short stories." So I'm like, "Really?" Because I don't. This is my first collection. I don't know these things, right? So she said. So we talked about that a lot, and then when my editor got it, also, she was like, "Order is very important," and there's a lot of heavy things. So I was
Yeah.
like, and there's some are long and some are short. So I was trying to make it so that if there was something heavy, there could be something lighter, to give the reader a little bit of relief. And if there's something long, then there's something short. So they can just, if they're wanting to read just something really quick, there's like 4 or 5 flash fiction pieces in here. So I deliberately did that, and I really wanted to end it on the story it ended on because it's a story of hope and resilience. So I was intentional about that, and it was thanks to Kate from and my editor Janice that
Mm.
we were able to, and it went back and forth. Like it was a very interesting process just to think about theme and length and heaviness versus a little bit more lightness to the stories. So yeah, it was an interesting process, but I think it's good now. I hope so because it's gone to print and it's coming out in the world. So
Um, yeah, tell me a bit about that last story, A Strong Seed, because it does
Mhm.
it does stand out um for not being terribly haunted by anything. It really is a story of a family doing a thing. It's almost like flipping through a photo album of
Mhm.
this was a little thing some people got up to. Can you
Yeah.
can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, this is one of the stories that was gifted to me because I have a friend, Ray, who told a story about from his people out in Ontario about how a seed and the roots grow and then a flower comes up and that's the roots of your family and you are a strong seed. And I was like, oh, so I asked if I could use that concept
Hmm.
because a story came to me like boom, as it does sometimes like that, right? And I wanted to write something about a girl's first dancing at a powwow and how her mother felt embarrassed to be doing that. Because, like
Hmm.
I said, I've always felt kind of uncomfortable in my own skin that way. So I've pictured myself as a mother watching, if I were to have a daughter, watching her do what I couldn't do because it was taken from me as a fully colonized kind of indigenous person, and seeing the joy of the family of taking that back and just dancing and the joy of the dance. So that's
Hmm.
kind of, and I wanted to end the stories on that because a lot of time indigenous literature, indigenous people are defined only by trauma,
Hmm.
which there is a lot of that in these stories. But I also wanted to make sure that when you close the book, you knew that that was not it, that we are defined by love and resilience and joy and family.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's also humor. There's a very gentle joke at the father's expense who's having
Yeah.
difficulty processing the maturation of his daughter. And
Mhm.
he's I think he offers some positive sentiment and then has to like slink away and go like sort his head out or something.
Yeah. I'm gonna tease my brother about it. He's just a new dad to a 3-month-old baby girl, so I'm gonna tease him for the next 16 years.
Um there are a lot of dads in this collection.
Hmm.
There are a lot of really good dads, a lot of loving dads. Um, and and it made me first. That's the first thing that stood out to me as I was thinking. These are great dads. These are dads for me to for me to emulate and hang out with.
Hmm.
But they're really part of just like family as a really dominant theme. Every character seems to be they're a member of a family of some kind. Their family is
Hmm.
either undergoing some kind of stress that's pulling at their connections, or they're fighting to reintegrate maybe or create a family
Hmm.
from like a chosen family. Um, is family just a place that's always been kind of fertile for you as a writer?
I think it must be. I'm very blessed to have a lovely family. Like I have my obviously my dad, who inspired the Berry Pickers. My mom, my stepmom. I have four siblings. I'm like four siblings. I have 5 nieces and nephews. Like I just feel very blessed. I still talk to my aunties and my uncles and my cousins a
Mm,
lot, and there are many of us on both sides. I told you my dad's one of 14, my mom's one of six. So fertile ground, and just family was always around me. You grow up in a rural area and your family's right there, right?
mhm,
Oh, everybody's just right there. So I think I just been very blessed, to have these lovely people in my life, and I just want to, I guess it's part of, like I said, who I am. And I was talking to a book club yesterday, and I said I couldn't have written these stories when I was 21. I couldn't have written this book when I was 21
mm,
because I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the wherewithal to think that I am so blessed with these family and friends that I have. So I'm glad that they came out now when I'm in my 40s. But yeah, I think family is very important, and not all families are fantastic. Some of them, even in the book,
mhm,
and the short stories, there's fracture. But I think that family is important. Whether you make your own family or you're born into it.
mm. When you were 21 and couldn't have written these stories, what were you writing?
I was writing other stories for sure. I love writing. I actually wrote a short story for a Japanese textbook when I lived in Japan. I don't know whatever happened to that. I can't even remember what I wrote, but I remember I wrote one. But I've always been writing, and I still have those, but I would have to go back and just look at those, and I haven't done that because I've been super busy with this, and I'm writing a new novel.
Mhm,
So I'm just like really busy, but I have to go back, and I imagine they're quite bad, and I'd love to go back and see those and see what I did and how I might be able to work with them
mm.
to make them better now. But
Were you one of the siblings among your siblings? Were you the one were you exceptionally imaginative? Were you the story spinner?
yeah, I think yeah, I remember with my cousins, on my mom's side, we would get together every summer and we made up these games, and it was me and my cousin James. We always made up Greenhead and Lost in the Forest and we superheroes, and we had a great time. There was so much imagination, and my mom read up. My mom is a ferocious reader, and she always read us books. She actually read from the Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Andersen instead of Disney. So I was just always had this imagination going on. I also was scared of Marcius because of the Marsh King's Daughter by Hans Andersen for the longest time when I was younger. But I always was around story and my dad telling stories. And yeah, I think it just sunk in somewhere.
When did it click for you then to pursue this as like to get serious about it and really make a go of it?
I've always wanted to do it, but back in the 90s when I was graduating high school and people were like, don't go into the fine arts. There's no money there. You're going to be
Mm,
poor, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. So I did what I was supposed to. I went and got a whole bunch of education and got a good job. And I got married, bought the house, the whole deal, got the cat. And I was like, okay, it's 2012. I got all this that people say I should have. Let's focus and do what you want to do. So I just signed up for a course at the University of Toronto's continuing ed
mhm.
in how to write a novel. And I loved it so much. I did the whole certificate over 4 years, and that while working full time. And then I was just kind of floundering for a year, just writing a little bit here, a little bit there, when a friend told me about the Institute for American Indian Arts. So I applied, and that was just a fantastic experience for me.
Picking up this craft then, in adulthood, I wonder, you mentioned an emerging writer prize which you won for the title story of this collection, Waiting for the Long
Mhm.
Night Moon. Looking through looking at your Wikipedia page or what have you, there's a lot of those emerging new, all of these like these words that connote probably the 21. They would bring to mind the 21-year-old version of you,
Hmm. Hmm.
but she didn't win them. You won them. I imagine it's a little strange, being something like I mean, quote unquote overnight success. Like, your debut novel is a big hit,
Yeah.
critical, and people love it, and it's all over the place. It does really well. What's it like that, having this, discovering at midlife, like, oh, it turns out I'm wildly talented at this other thing.
I don't know about wildly, but I'm still in the pinch me phase,
Hmm.
really. When I wrote the book, I thought like my family would read it, maybe a few folks here in Nova Scotia. I never anticipated that it would be published in the US, for one
Hmm.
thing. And I never anticipated 15 languages around the world.
Yeah.
Like these are not things that I ever thought of. So I'm kind of still, even though it's been a year and a bit since it's been published, but almost a year in the US because it was published there in November.
Yeah.
I'm still in pinch me phase. I'm like, what's happening? Like, I don't understand. Like, and my dreams have literally come true. And now I got a job teaching as an associate professor at Acadia University here in the Annapolis Valley, which is only 10 minutes from my house, which is brilliant. But now I literally get paid to talk about writing and reading and to read and write. They pay me to do the things that I love to do. And I just feel like I'm just living the dream. Literally, that's not just a phrase anymore. So I'm very excited. And people send me free books. I mean, that's amazing. I get to read books before they come out. And I'm like, this is so exciting.
You said in an interview published on Shondaland's site, interview with Sarah Nielsen, that it's always been harder to connect with your indigenous roots because you weren't raised in the culture. Um, and you've mentioned that earlier. Um, but writing is that way in for you. Um, can you tell me though, how did indigeneity factor into your home life when you were growing up?
Well, I always knew I was Mi'kmaq. Well, maybe from a little younger age, I didn't because people just assumed I knew
Right.
because they just assume you do. But I always knew I was Mi'kmaq. My dad has always been in my life. My family has always been in my life because my dad is Mi'kmaq, my mom is not. So I've always been part of his life and part of the family. But I don't know. My grandparents had made the choice not to live on reserve. They had moved off reserve
Mhm.
and bought their own land and built a home. And I don't know. We didn't really. And it was also the time when I was growing up where there weren't really celebrations like Maliomis and powwows and stuff that were happening, and there wasn't the resurgence of the language wasn't happening yet, and all that kind of stuff. So. I was just like, I wasn't surrounded by it all the time. It wasn't until I actually started working with my communities broadly in Atlantic Canada and then my own personal community, Glooskap First Nation, where I started to kind of like be okay. This is how we operate. This is how we are Mi'kmaq. But I still didn't really feel and it's not always, it's just sometimes I feel like, who am I supposed to be in this situation?
Right.
Right? Am I allowed to be this person? Do I have to change myself in this situation? And I found that when I went to the Institute for American Indian Arts, I didn't have to make that choice. I could just be who I was, which was brilliant. And in my writing, I just was comfortable expressing my indigeneity through that. And I think it's because I'm I'm a relatively shy person. You wouldn't know it now because I have to do these all the time. So I've just been like coming out of my shell at 47 years old. But I'm relatively shy. So it's an easy way for me to like express myself and express who I am and what I want the world to know about who I am through my writing. It's very therapeutic.
Um, as you came to that realization that you spoke of earlier about um, finding um, finding authenticity
Hmm.
in speaking to indigenous stories, and that you can tell these stories, you can
Hmm.
lend your voice to this. Um, can you tell me a little bit about that process of how you came to connect with that? What nudged you in that direction, or what did you have to kind of break down to get there?
Yeah, well, it was quite accidental. I think most of my life has been the good things are quite accidental. I was tasked with writing a piece of historical fiction when I was at a writing retreat in
Mhm.
Toronto. And everybody in the class was like talking about Toronto history, and it was all non-Indigenous, non-people of color, all very Caucasian, European, Eurocentric historical fiction. And I was like, well, I don't know the indigenous people in this area. I'm Mi'kmaq, but they must have been here, right? So I said, I'm going to write that. And it was just kind of like maybe a moment of stubbornness on my
Mm,
part, where I was like, I'm going to write that. And I wrote it, and it got a lot of praise in the class when they read it. And I was like, oh, maybe I can write these. So then I just started writing. Like I said, I just started writing the first things that came to my brain. But then I was a little bit concerned of violating protocol or something, my protocol in my stories. So I did hand them off to a friend of mine who is very established in the culture and the language. And I said, can you read these? And he said to me, he brought them back and he was working with me at the time and he set them on my desk and he said to me, this is how you're a Mi'kmaq. This is how you're Mi'kmaq. You don't have to worry. These are beautiful. I was like, oh. So then not that it gave me permission because nobody's going to give me permission, but it just allowed me to think for myself that I can do this and it's okay. And let's write these stories and let's share these stories.
mhm. There's there's a tension between worlds. I mean, it underlies exactly what we were speaking about, but it's one of the themes of these stories. What I really enjoyed is the tension between worlds that we see in these stories is not, it's not uniformly like agonizing.
Hmm.
Like there's some good-natured teasing about it as well. Who knows tradition best, or like, making fun of teasing grandpa for overdoing it a bit, of like,
Yeah.
we'd rather be inside playing video games or whatever, but okay, grandpa, let's go be on the land. Like, I get it.
Yeah.
There's also there's also some fun stuff about, like, white folks' perceptions of indigenous folks being like, capital T tradition, like
Hmm.
24/7.
Yeah.
That's in the story. What is it? It's Tiny Birds and Terrorists.
Hmm.
That one actually made me chuckle. Um, I wonder though about these little these like gentle games of tug of war. Are these conversations that you've overheard, things that maybe that feel like now you have the words, the character will speak this, or is it more like a feeling that you just kind of work out in the writing by creating characters on different sides of an issue?
Yes.
Yes.
So I think it's a little bit of both, right? Because indigenous people often deal with things with humor.
Yeah.
It's just how we deal with the world around us. Even when something is can be tragic, there's often humor involved in it. So there's going to be humor, and we tease each other. There's a lot of teasing, right? So it had to be in there that this teasing, but they're also while they're teasing, they're facing some pretty serious issues. So in Tiny Birds and Terrorists, there's quite a bit of humor in there and making fun and jesting, but they're also fighting for their rights to clean water at the same time. So I think it's just an indigenous way of facing the world is teasing and if you're not being teased, someone probably doesn't like you.
Right.
So make sure that you're getting a tease a little bit and make sure there's humor and jokes. But also that's how we deal with the world, even when there's a traumatic issue. It's often how it's dealt with. So I wanted to make sure that that was reflected in the stories that there is humor.
Hmm. Hmm.
Did
Um,
I answer your question? Did I
I think you
answer
did. Yeah,
that?
marvelously. Thank you.
Okay. Sometimes I ramble.
Oh, rambling's fine. That's this show is made for rambling. We can do
Woohoo.
rambling. Um, I want to ask you about a story in this collection called Angry White Indian.
Mm,
There's a scene in it that I found really striking. I think the whole story may just be one scene, it stayed with me. Um, a woman in a bar overhears some people complaining loudly about their tax dollars being wasted, quote unquote, in some vague way. They don't quite like, they're not exactly criticizing the finance minister's budget in front of them or anything like that. But generally, they have a feeling of like waste that has something to do with a nearby population of indigenous peoples.
hmm
Um, the woman that we're getting this story through the perspective, our eyes and ears in the room, she is indigenous, but she is
hmm
white passing.
hmm
Can you tell me about writing her perspective?
Oh, her perspective is my perspective. Because I am white passing. You wouldn't know I was indigenous really, unless we were talking about it.
Hmm.
And that story actually happened. I am so not the
Hmm.
end, the good part at the end. That didn't happen. I
Yeah.
wish it did. I wish I was that brave to do something like that, but that didn't happen. But I was sitting at
Yep.
a bar once. It was the only bar restaurant in this little tiny area where I was visiting another community. And that happened. They were sitting there talking about this right in front of me. And I was just like, I have to leave. So I just got up and left. I didn't do what she does in the story, which is what I would have loved to do with brave enough. So I think that's just my experience as being that person. And there's a lot of us, there's a lot of white passing indigenous people. And there's this guilt with that
Hmm.
because we don't have to deal with situations that even our own siblings, like my brother's quite dark and indigenous looking, and then me and my sister are very non. So genetics is genetics, right? So,
Yeah.
and we struggle with that, white passing people. We struggle with that. Like, are we using that? I hope I'm not using that, right? There's these questions, and with all this pretending and stuff coming up, like people are you actually indigenous? And it's
Yeah.
just it's so much to take in, and so I do think about it a lot. So I really wanted to write something like that, and I was like, well, let's talk about that situation back. I think that actually happened around 2010. That happened to me. So yeah, I think it's just a personal perspective of understanding being in that situation, and that's not the only time that has happened.
Hmm.
I have been in rooms where people have told the most inappropriate jokes.
Yep.
Yeah, and I've been in
I will
rooms.
say for listeners that there were big air quotes around jokes just now,
Oh
like
yes, there were big
massive
stories.
fingers, huge
Yeah.
fingers around jokes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're not jokes. They're just ignorant. So I've been in those rooms and I've had to say things, right? When I was younger, I wouldn't say anything. I'd just
Hmm.
leave.
Yeah.
Now as I get older, there's this freedom of being in your 40s, and just saying that's inappropriate. Maybe you want to shut up, right? Or
Yeah.
maybe you want to educate yourself. So yeah, I really enjoyed writing that story because the ending is how I would love to have actually dealt with that situation. But I just left because I was back at a time where I would leave a situation.
Yeah. I mean, the leaving still strikes me because it's a it's still a brave choice to leave because the
Mm,
other option is on the table to just like turn as invisible as you can and like find a door later when
yeah.
leaving wouldn't draw any attention to
Yeah,
yourself.
that is true. I guess that's true. Yeah. I never thought about it that way.
I think I'm articulating my choice as a white passing mixed person, which was often to just like freeze and like and just
Yeah.
wait for the storm to pass under a shrub or whatever.
Yeah, I hear you.
Is that is that perhaps, I mean, it sucks, like to be clear. Nobody, like, it's horrible to hear people speaking very freely about how low their low opinion of your heritage. But I also wonder, like, as a writer, it's it, it's got to be incredible on some level that like you're hearing things and people are speaking freely and you're getting a perspective that's just
Mm.
shut off to so many. Like you're in a place witnessing a thing like on an anthropological level alone, but like
Yeah.
but also just as a writer of narrative and character to
Mhm.
hear people speaking, just giving voice to those beliefs.
Yeah, and I think it's my responsibility to put them in a book and show them not in the most favorable of lights. I mean, these older gentlemen would never read my book anyway, but just showing people that be careful who you're talking about and what you're talking about,
Yeah.
and educate yourself too, so that you're not as ignorant, openly ignorant in public.
In the acknowledgments,
Mm.
you thank Katharina Vermette, you
Mhm.
mentioned earlier.
Yep.
You thanked her specifically for helping you mold these stories. And you mentioned what sounded like a series of semi-desperate phone calls around creative consultation. Can you tell me about these phone calls?
Yeah, so that was part of the Rising Stars program, right? So I got to be mentored by her, which I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited, right?
Yeah.
Because she's brilliant.
And
So
I'll mention for listeners, Catherine Vermette, author of The Break, is a major book of hers. Also, there's a graphic novel series about a girl named Echo, which is fantastic. Great way to learn about Métis culture and heritage, and they're just great books. So, but please go on now that I've done my bookseller thing and tried to sell some books. Okay.
no worries. So I was very honored that she had chosen me for the Rising Stars program and that I got to work with her. And but she was in Winnipeg and I am in Nova Scotia. So the mentorship, and she liked to talk when she walks and moves. So she would like, let's have a phone call conversation. And everybody was zoomed out, right? It was
Yeah.
COVID, everybody's zoomed out.
Yeah.
She's like, let's have a phone call while I'm walking my dogs. So she would read the work and then she would write a notes and then she'd go and walk her dogs and I would pace in my living room across and we would talk for like an hour and a half and just talk through things, right? She's like, why did you make this choice in this story? You might want to rethink how this is working because it's not like she was like just questioning like the choices I made, and she would come out and sometimes just say this doesn't work, rethink it, and it was just great because then I would talk it through. And I think a lot of people come to conclusions through talking through. I know women do, especially, right? Just talking things through. So having another person who's so good at what she does, helping me think through and talk through what I wanted, what I was trying to get across in the stories was really, really helpful. So yeah, we had a lot of those just phone calls with her walking the dogs and me pacing in my living room. So it was great.
Amanda, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been great. Great conversation. Thank you.
I have been speaking with Amanda Peters, author of The Berry Pickers and the new short story collection, Waiting for the Long Night Moon. Find it and all the books we spoke about at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. There is a link in the show notes. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell somebody who appreciates a good story. Kobo and Conversation is produced and hosted this time around by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.